Hello, everyone. In this video, I will discuss risk and returns associated with letter of credit. So as I indicated earlier, that letter of credit can be two types, documentary letter of credit and standby letter of credit. In selling documentary letter of credit and a standby letter of credit for fees, financial institution adds to their contingent future obligations. Both in letter of credit and standby letter of credit are essentially guarantees sold by financial institutions to underwrite the performance of the buyer of the guarantee. For example, a company. In economic terms, the financial institution that sell LCs or SLCs, I mean letter of credit or standby letter of credit, is selling insurance against the frequency or severity of some particular future occurrences. First of all, documentary letter of credit, which is essentially a contingent guarantee sold by a financial institution to underwrite a trade or commercial performance of the buyer of the guarantee. Okay, so documentary letter of credit or simply letter of credit are widely used in most domestic and international trade. For example, to ease the transport of vegetables between a grower in the country regions to a buyer in the city, or the shipment of goods between an Australian importer and a foreign exporter. The financial institution's role is to provide a formal guarantee that payment of goods shipped or sold will be forthcoming in the future, regardless of whether the buyer of the goods defaults on payment or not. If you look at this example, suppose the Australian importer sets an order, this is Australian importer, sets an order for a $10 million worth of machinery to a Singaporean exporter. However, the Singaporean exporter may be reluctant to send the goods without some assurance or guarantee of being paid once the goods are shipped. The Australian importer may promise to pay for the goods in 90 days, but the Singaporean exporter may feel insecure either because it knows little about creditworthiness of the Australian importer or because the Australian importer has a low credit rating. To persuade the Singaporean exporter to ship the goods, the Australian importer may have to turn to an Australian financial institution with whom it has developed a long-term customer relationship. In its role as a lender and monitor, the Australian financial institution can appraise the creditworthiness of the Australian importer. The Australian financial institution can issue a contingent payment guarantee, that is an LC, to the Singaporean exporter on the importer's behalf. In return for an LC fee paid by the Australian importer. So in our example, the financial institution would send an LC to Singaporean exporter guaranteeing payment for the goods in 90 days, regardless of whether the importer defaults on its obligation to Singaporean exporter. Implicitly, the financial institution is replacing the credit risk of the Australian importer with its own credit risk guarantee. Toward this substitution to work effectively in guaranteeing payment, the financial institution must have a higher credit standing or better credit quality reputation than Australian importer. Okay, once the financial institution issues the LC and sends it to Singaporean exporter, the exporter ships the goods to the Australian importer, and which is shown by this arrow. There is a high probability that in 90 days time, the Australian importer will pay the Singaporean exporter for the goods sent, and financial institution keep the fee as profit. The fee is perhaps the 10 basis point of the face value of the letter of credit. So in this example, it will be $10,000. Standby letter of credit, SLCs, on the other hand, perform an insurance function similar to documentary letter of credit. However, the structure and type of risk covered is different. Financial institution may issue SLCs to cover contingencies that are potentially more severe, less predictable, or frequent and not necessarily trade related. These contingencies include the performance bond guarantees, where a financial institution may guarantee that a real estate development will be completed in some interval of time. Alternatively, it may offer default guarantees to back an issue of promissory notes or corporate bonds to allow issuer to achieve a higher credit rating and lower funding costs than they would otherwise be able to do. Now, you understand that in both cases, if it is a letter of credit or a standby letter of credit, financial institution is exposed to default risk, because if the customer, that financial institution, is guaranteeing defaults, then it will become a liability for the financial institution. Now, the risk of financial institution in selling a letter of credit is that the buyer of letter of credit may fail to perform as promised under the contractual obligation. For example, the example just I showed here, there exists a small probability that the Australian importer would be unable to pay $10 million in 90 days and would default. Then the financial institution will be obliged to make good on its guarantee that the contractual obligation will be fulfilled. The cost of such a default could mean a payment of $10 million to the exporter by the guaranteeing financial institution, although it would have a creditor's claim against the assets of the importer to offset the loss. Likewise, for the SLC's standby letter of credit, there is a small probability that say promissory note issuer will be unable to pay the promissory note holder, let's say $100 million as promised on maturity. So the financial institution will then be obliged to pay this $100 million to promissory note holders. Clearly, the LC fee should exceed the expected default risk on the LC or SLC, which is equal to the probability of default by counterparty multiplied by the expected net payout on the LC after adjusting for the financial institution's ability to reclaim assets from the defaulting importer or the promissory note issuer. And obviously, that also should include any other monetary cost. So that's the end of our discussion on the risk and return associated with a letter of credit and a standby letter of credit. In the next video, I will discuss risk and return associated with derivatives and loans sold. Thank you very much.